I'm Tom Kempel here at the Department of Sociology. I teach social theory, and I'm very grateful to Michael for allowing this kind of last-minute scheduling to bring the illustrious Terrell Carver to speak with us for our research program. Terrell Carver is a professor of political theory at Bristol in the UK. He comes to us by way of Iowa, Idaho, excuse me, which borders our province, believe it or not. He's the editor-in-chief for several, one of the editors for several book series, including the one that I'm publishing in any day now, the Engels Marxisms series with Palgrave, and he recently published a wonderful biography of Engels called Engels Before Marx. So I've read the abstract for that. I highly recommend it. So it's sort of disentangling while reconnecting Marx and Engels. He's also done multiple translations and award-winning biography of Engels. He's the editor-in-chief of Contemporary Political Theory. I highly recommend this book as well, which is part of the Polity series, which I'm also published in. His is on Marx, and it really changed the way that I think about Marx as an activist and a writer and a thinker at the same time. I also highly recommend his book, Postmodern Marx, which is somewhat of a misleading title when you get into it because it's a very serious scholarly engagement with the Marx tradition, with the Marx reception, while also acknowledging that Marx was himself, in some ways, what we sometimes think about as a proto-postmodern. Today's talk is somewhat of a departure from what I would expect Professor Carver to do. This is from his most recent book, Masculinities, Gender, and International Relations. So join me in welcoming Professor Terrell Carver.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom, for the very generous introduction. And it's wonderful to be here, especially in such glorious weather. So I'm having a wonderful time. This is a bit of a promo for this book that's published just the 6th of September. So I will tell you the story of the book. It's Bristol University Press, and the idea came from a former student, although not in this kind of class, but I guess he'd sort of tracked what was going on and talked to other people. And so he said, I thought you might have something to say. So that is the beginning of the story. I'll resolve the biographical puzzle very neatly, which is how did Marx, Engels, and Marxism relate to sex, gender, and sexuality? Because people look at the mishmash of publications, so they easily assume it's two different people, one of which is a woman, which doesn't bother me. I do get emails addressed in that mode. So the resolution of this is actually very simple. What makes the world go round? Sex and money. Okay, that's just like it. So they are connected, and that's what this book is about. What makes the world go round? Sex and money. So you'll see that kind of graphically illustrated as we go along. So that's actually the book. We got a terrific endorsement from Cynthia Erlo, who is the kind of good fairy hanging over this book. So if you find that quite a lot of Erlo in the whole outlook and in my remarks, I mean, that's actually quite deliberate. We became Scotch-looking buddies at various conferences over the years. So a big credit to Laura Liddon, who's a former PhD student. All our PhDs are co-supervised. And I did that.
Can you speak loudly, please, or close to the mic? Thanks.
Whatever, techno break. With Paul Highgate, so she wanted to work within the feminist IR security studies frame on the legitimate arms trade rather than the sort of criminalized arms trade, which kind of gets the sort of sensational headlines. So Paul actually does embedded work with private security agencies and actually went under cover and signed up to be private security guard and do the training when this was all going on in Iraq and Afghanistan and things like that. So, you know, I mean, this is kind of the way that we do things. So, if we then fast forward to the idea for the book, the empirical and ethnographic sections of the book are very much Laura's research from the PhD, but it's fronted up by me with a reprise of my theoretical take on the whole subject, which I'll explain, and that actually developed quite a lot in the course of writing the book, which I think I got through in less than 2 years in terms of drafts. So that was a very, very good collaboration. And the book wouldn't have happened without the empirical studies, which one can get really quite involved in and are really quite mind-blowing and eye-popping, as I'll explain. And so I say it's pushed my own theorisations along. So the book was designed to be a kind of 101 for everybody who might have heard about the masculinity thing and wondered what's going on. So it's written, I hope, accessibly for students, academic staff, even perhaps general readers. Although for marketing purposes, it's got to have an eye on the title so the publisher can sell it. Laura's PhD could have been a monograph in a feminist security studies series. And so there's a bit of a choice there. That she signed up to this because it would have a much broader audience and get fronted out to a much bigger community, which is, thank you very much, this is what we're doing today, rather than a contribution to that particular literature, which being a PhD thesis, that was what it was aimed toward. So, in terms of my own background in this, and this again is another crossover, in the sort of mid-1980s, feminism, feminist activism struck partly for personal reasons, partly because it was the heyday of Marxist feminism. And some Marxist feminists were very interested in Engels and the origin of family property in the state. So I got involved in that, arguing that they'd been rather too kind to him and it was much more sexist than had been made out. So, that began to play out over the years. So the first academic sociological conference on men and masculinity held in Britain very shortly after the kind of movement within a feminist frame. You may want to ask about that or have issues, but anyway, the people at the time said it was. That was held in Bradford in Yorkshire, and I went along to that. So Jeff Hearn was there, he's English, Michael Kaufman from Toronto, Harry Broad, the historian, who's American, as is Michael Kimmel, who's still associated with the journal Men and Masculinity. So in conversation with Michael Kimmel, he said, well, you've shown, somewhat differently how Engels theorizes women, but in theorizing women, Engels theorizes men, which is an important methodological point. So I went back to the article and rewrote it the other way around, and that was published in the kind of first iteration of Masculinities with a small n, was published. So we can now move forward to the theoretical takeaway here, which I developed in an article building again on feminist insights from the era of the public-private divide and that kind of debate, which is, in gender terms, men get 2 cracks at it, which women don't. The first crack at it they get to be the human generic individual citizen, human exemplar, the norm, and all of that kind of thing. So this kind of has been bubbling up since Mary Wollstonecraft, but anyway, by the time we get to the 80s and the 90s, it's really pretty much on the oil, and if we then fast forward to a couple of years ago, with Caroline Criado-Claros. I think that's the book that shows in great detail how so many scientific, medical, and other kinds of studies excluded women from the test group and produced all kinds of norms and standards which were covertly really derived from men and ignored females in the first place, and female difference second. So I've illustrated that here with man as the generic human in the spiritual sense in relation to God, who unsurprisingly looks like a man, and the physical sense, and also that's the Raphael school of Athens. So it's like, we are the thing, we are humanity, we have knowledge, rationality, all of that going for us. So this is the apparently degendered human individual who is covertly gendered masculine. So if we then flip, which you can often find in discourse and comments in the things that people write, mostly men, we flip to the gendered male, masculine being. These are the husbands, fathers, brothers, uncles, mates, all of that. And men are very good at sort of flipping back and forth. So here's some mates at the top, who are husbands, fathers, brothers, uncles, and things like that, all looking happy and smiling and pleased with themselves in this kind of identity which they exemplify. And of course, we know some bad things about them, but never mind, that gets erased, and the gendered male masculine norm is validated here and legitimated. And I pulled this other one up from Christian fundamentalism because I thought it was rather fun. So that's what happens there. However, we flip from that group to this group. And what is the relationship there? What has that got to do with? So this is looking at things discursively, at the kind of rhetorical and argumentative moves that actually get made. So when we have the gendered males who are moralized as good and they turn out to be criminals, rapists, pedophiles, sex pests, unfaithful, etc., etc. Is there any connection? No, because we cycle back to the generic human individual and the problem of human evil, okay? Not the problem of masculinity and men who do these evil things. So the next slide, this is a picture of human evil. If you may not recognize these individuals, but they're kind of the Hitler reference point for unimaginable horror and evil. They are Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, they're both dead now. They were the so-called Moors, murderers. They tortured children, etc. So this is very famous in the 1950s. They were locked up for the rest of their lives. They just became ionic pictures of evil. Look at the gender balance there. They're always pictured together. This is a picture of human evil. Men, women, male, female. This is a kind of gender equality when we want it to be there and get ourselves off the hook in seeing what connections there might be between bad men and the good exemplars that we've been looking at. So let's look a bit further into this. Anyone who's in criminology knows it's very difficult to define and assemble statistics on criminals and crime all over the world, and all kinds of difficulties with it. Rather similarly with incarceration or being in the less justice system or anything like that. And I think one has an intuition that there are more men in prison than there are women. So this happens to be the US figures, but I don't think it's that much different all over the world. The gender imbalance here is pretty striking. 93% to some tiny percent. What's going on here? Maybe women are just as criminal as men, but a whole lot better at getting away with it. Do you think that might be true? It could be true. But actually, I don't really think so. Now, this is not an argument that women are nice and then do bad things. Some of them weren't nice and they did bad things. But there is something going on here that really needs investigating. And one does this by getting over the usual boundary line between goodness and badness, between exemplary moral figures, who might have the occasional tincture of clay, and the really bad people in the world. And it's overwhelmingly men. So I think there's a kind of problem here, and my job in a sense is to identify the displacements that make it difficult to get curious about this. So this is an invocation of Cynthia Enloe here, which is one of her mantras is think about all the work that goes into making you incurious, otherwise known as normalization and legitimation in sort of slightly fancier language. But I think that's actually a kind of helpful thing to think about. So let's go from this picture of criminality to that picture. Okay, jumping over some more boundary lines here and just aligning things that I usually kept miles apart. So here we have the G7 and the G20 and world leader summits. So, I mean, for many, many years, since the women have been pointing out how women are not present and if they, except as cleaners and cooks and that type of thing. And how there should be more inclusion, all of which is perfectly fine. And that's sort of come up through in my lifetime, through the 1970s and 1980s and processes of equality, diversity, and inclusion that we're used to. But this, of course, somewhat begs the question, what are women or Indigenous or anybody else being graciously included into that caused the exclusion issue in the first place? So this is, after 40 years more or less of EDI, these are quite striking. So this is the kind of IR feminist literature of Spot the Woman. There is a famous picture of the G20 where there are more palm trees than women in the picture. And if you look carefully, there Angela Merkel appears there, Theresa May and Christine Lagarde. But you have to look really pretty hard in this wash of suits. So this is to say, and it's getting on to one of the main argument of the book, which is that the really rich, wealthy, power, influential nation-state structures in the world are overwhelmingly male-dominated. But it surprises me very much how easy it is for students or anybody just to erase this as an important fact, other than to say, well, there should be more inclusion. And as I say, after 40 years, if you look at the entire history of the world and every president and monarch and prime minister and everything, the number of females occupying those roles is in the low dozens. And I mean, this is quite news to a lot of students, who are born not very long ago, even to those who are a bit older. So this is kind of driving us to incuriosity and normality. And it's, I mean, if you start saying things like this, you get accused of being dismissive, or dismissing feminism, or of, quote, making the whole thing look hopeless, unquote, which is what Sandy Whitworth and said. So I don't mean to do that, but I think the scale of the problem is interesting, as is the scale of the erasure. So I had a kind of seminar exercise which I ran through a number of seminars with quite different people in these seminars, because we have one-year master's programs with Albanians and kinds of students. And the opening was, feminism is a theory of the oppression of women by fill in the blank. Go around the group. Well, there's tradition, there's history, there's structures, there's gender, there's bad ideas, there's religion, you know, and group after group after group, it was entirely abstract. So I'm saying, little word, you know, 3 letters, sounds like, to get people to say, men. And students have it, female students, and male ones actually, come up afterwards and said, you know, that's really interesting, it's fun to say that word. And I know from the, well, I have been told from the female point of view, there are lots of reasons why you don't want to go around irritating men. There might be consequences, so I mean, I do understand that. But I did a short blog post called the N-word, just to kind of flag this. And as I say, some people have picked it up and said that it's useful. So if we move on from that to another hierarchy of power, wealth, and influence, and this is really getting into the book, we're looking at the world's largest arms suppliers. So here we have a hierarchy of nation states as arms manufacturers and suppliers, including small arms and light weapons, as well as all the big stuff that really blows stuff up. And of course, it very much matches the G7, G20, because you know they make a lot of money in that. And we get to the arms sales worldwide. This is a kind of economic background of it, and then we get to the death certificates, or the death statistics here, which we don't need to spend too much time on. I mean, you know, just watch the news, especially lately. That sort of thing has been going on during my lifetime. Major powers have been dropping bombs and shooting people, intervening and supposedly keeping the peace and all that kind of thing. So this is, you know, kind of tracking the amount of violence and destruction that goes on. But of course, this is segregated off into what is domestic, what is international, what is, you know, just gunfire and stuff, and what is actually blowing stuff up and really. They're all kind of kept in separate news boxes. So the genre of news reporting is really interesting here, so you don't get too confused, see, by trying to connect dots. So this is getting close to the major theorisation that takes place in the book and the structure of the book. So the structures that are aligned here are what I've called imbricated hierarchies. So we have a hierarchy of nation states based on power and wealth, of which arms production is an index and effect and a cause as to where they are. We've got some hierarchies of so-called private business, which is deeply implicated in all of these processes. Necessarily, because many of the processes are the same. I mean, the animators down in Gastown who do video games are, you know, doing military contracts, and it's picked up through the chain because of the kinds of tests and technologies and things that go on. So you know, there's a direct connection between toys and games and actually modern so-called warfare. And terrorism, and the people who do improvised electronic devices are, you know, electronics people, are they? So these things are all connected. So we've got the those two hierarchies. The political nation-state top leaders hierarchies aligned with the top businesses, which are leveraging in the top companies, and that aligns with the world's top militaries, because they're all one and the same thing, and in many cases the same people going round and round and round, doing these different kinds of things. So the theorisation here is one of gender order hierarchy, because gender is an asymmetrical binary in the first place, as I've explained. So this is an order of masculinity over femininity, and some men over others in nested hierarchies of competitive domination and subordination. So if you take all of that on board and then look at the order of sovereign states and the production of weaponry and the competitions for power and wealth that go on in and through the military, so way past the military civilian boundary line here, you can see that actually going on. So the point here is not that men control this and exercise this common kind of domination, but they have ways of organizing this process amongst themselves which exclude females and feminine, but also these processes work through what are called nested hierarchies here. So quite a bit of this theorisation comes from the movie G.I. Jane, which International Feminist Journal of Politics ran a forum on that. So I'm not claiming this is, a definitive reading of the movie, and different feminists and others read the movie in different ways, but I think it's a very instructive movie on the subject of masculinity. So without going through, it is a Hollywood blockbuster genre movie. It is very irritating and annoying in many ways that I just don't bother with. So what it does is set up the alpha maleness of the Navy SEALs, and it takes someone who isn't a man, and she inserts herself or is allowed in through the pressure, by putting pressure because of the interest within these hierarchies. So the trope is a very old one. You take something that isn't human, like a stone, and make a human out of it. Well, this is taking a woman and making a man. So if they'd taken a man, it would be kind of boring because we know all of that. So the excruciating detail of the movie is, in a sense, a 101 of exemplary masculinity and how that works in terms of bodies and mind, in particular, how important so-called competition is. So this is not competition with regular rules and level playing field, and it's not like that at all. This is a competition that works by creating the alphaness, because some men dominate, subordinate, and make others fail. So there's a huge emphasis throughout the movie on failure. You are not good enough, and that's what makes the ones who are left good. So I think there's a really important dynamic there, and that again shows you the erasure through liberal notions of competition and inclusion and equality and opportunity and things like that as a definition of competition, whereas this is about being good because others fail. And that all operates within an entirely male world, except for herself. So this theorisation actually comes from teaching the movement, I will confess. So what else goes on in the book? There's a queer theory, queer studies kind of chapter. So I do remember talking to Laura, and it sort of came up, are there any nation states, because they're all in a hierarchy, and they know where they are in the hierarchy, and they're competitive, and they compete kind of within their group for, being slightly up and down. It's not like the ones at the bottom are trying to overthrow the top. It's not like that. So the answer to that turned out to be other countries without militaries who are out of the competition. This would be very queer, given the way the whole thing is set up from whatever. And the answer to that, of course, is Costa Rica. And so here's some Costa Rica memorabilia on that. So I've been in the army since 1948. I love having peace without the military. And things like that. If you look it up in Wikipedia, I think there are about just under 24 countries which don't have militaries. They're mostly tiny islands to go around, but actually Panama recently abolished their military. So is this a kind of queer nation, and what actually happens? Well, no, is the answer to that. The kind of competitive, among men masculinity is projected onto the football team, which embodies it performatively. And they really hit the headlines and had a great moment, I think, in 2014 with the World Cup, when the eyes of the world were on them. So there's a bit of memorabilia about that football team, because they describe themselves as Costa Rica's army. And they're going to march to victory on the battlefield of the football field, and they sing songs which I won't repeat here, but we're going to shove this somewhere, we're going to get it, all that kind of stuff. So they actually behave in this kind of militaristic, masculinizing mode with the football team, and they actually have quite a militarized police force. So that kind of brings up again, crossing the boundary lines, the way that military weaponry and training and all that kind of human technology training goes from the private companies to the military, but also down to the police forces. So there's a very good book by Paul Lamar and AMAR called The Security Archipelago, which kind of gets over the sort of domestic, national, civilian, military boundary line. So what's the payoff ethnographically in this book? Lining up quickly. Well, Laura's fieldwork was to talk herself into the closed arms trade affairs, which exist in London, principally. And it's very hard to get into these. They are tightly securitized. Protestors are kept at bay. She got in as a researcher, very surprisingly. So she went around doing feminist observation and we found another woman who did the same thing as a kind of artist, but she got kicked out because they realized what she was doing. But I mean, Laura, she describes all this in the book of going there and being, the kind of other and observing as an anthropologist what this tribe is doing. So you've got the top brass of the military, the top executives, and the top political representatives from the world doing these trades. And it's not trade, it's production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. So as these weapons are expended, they need replacement, and there's always the cutting edge of technology within the competitions that I've described that's going to drive more taxpayer funding into R&D and the military and that kind of thing. So there's a few pictures that I pulled up of men, which is unsurprising that overwhelmingly men. And this one I quite like. It looks just like Target or Staples or something like that. But if you look closely, you can see in the glass cases they're full of guns. And that's a kind of product display. So there's loads of more or less surprising ethnography going there. Very important dress codes that dressing up as well as general behavior. We also have a chapter on the protests and protesters. We were quite lucky that Chris Rossdale published his book about anti-military protests and the ethnographic work he'd done with protest groups about this, not in conjunction with us. And he coincidentally just turned up at Bristol as a colleague, so this was a real gift. And two things are going on now. One is they're all pretty straight ideological protests, but also very male-dominated and very unwilling to question the gender order hierarchy, and in particular masculinity. I mean, to some extent, they're not kind of sexist and homophobic. Sparkle's Not Shrapnel was an interesting kind of protest. This was a queer protest which actually did challenge the gender order hierarchy by challenging the gender and sexuality binaries and the whole heterosexist setup through all kinds of, you can imagine, carry on. That they did, turning up spontaneously, and besides that, it was interesting because it then targeted the top levels of the rich and powerful men, mostly, at the National Gallery in London. In other words, it went outside the frame to highlight the way all of this death and destruction is legitimated through the nation state and the cultural heritage of the nation, the foundations and charities, and how these mostly men get together and congratulate each other, and things like that. So I thought that was a kind of interesting moment of transgression. That's a couple of pictures of the more straight kinds of protests, and that's the table of contents of the book. So chapter 1 was a quote. More than one feminist said this to me long ago. Wasn't it always just about men anyway? And so my 2 cracks at it is a theorisation that answers that question, and I've taken you through the state angle and the arms and masculinity angle. That's 2 chapters, 3 and 4, and chapter 5 picks up the kind of protest angle. So thank you very much for your attention, and just about on time. Thank you.
You can field your own questions, and I'll keep an eye out.
Okay, good. Right.
And I am the staff.
Okay, and you'll check the chapters.
Yes. You can ask about anything or say anything. I really don't.
I'll go this. Thank you very much. This is a really interesting talk. So if you could say a little bit about, I thought your point earlier about who was sort of kept this gendered hierarchy, and the secret answer is men. I guess I sort of challenged that, right? Because what about the role of, there's many women, in fact, are involved in supporting the hierarchy that exists, right? So you think about the women in the United States that were really active in limiting other women's access to abortion, right? Which, in fact, reinforces the gender hierarchy. You think about women who were involved in sort of pro-gun movements, and in fact, women who, the American Congresswoman, who I had to just look up her name because I, in my own mental health, was never put her name in my own mind, but Bover, whatever her name is, who uses the sort of disjuncture for femininity with the gun to sort of highlight the gendered aspect of it, but also really reinforcing the gendered part of it. So I guess I would just say, that both men and women, in fact, are reinforcing this hierarchy, even though it actually disadvantages women at the same time. So how does that sort of play into this?
That is actually assumed. It's just, this is on the top level of power and domination and destruction. And certainly women are there supporting that. And simply invented the whole idea in about 1990. So that is a bit presumed here, because I wanted to focus on the decision-making levels, rather than focus on what women are able to do one way or another with one result going on. And I think it's really striking to put the focus on that. So this is meant to be a kind of lens. It's not a sociological kind of empirical descriptive theory of anything. It's a lens for looking at the where we are in terms of power and domination and hierarchies, and the way that hierarchy works, and how resistant it is, and why it's resistant to women. So a couple of comments on that. I kind of like to go to, what is this participation in how many women make a difference? There's still only 1 or 2 legislatures in the world where women have ever, even briefly, had a female majority. It happened in Iceland for about 48 hours and it mysteriously vanished. Recently, the Welsh Assembly had a female majority for a while. Even at that level, as I say, as you go further and further up the ranks, Oxfam claimed that half the world's wealth is owned and operated by a very small number of people who could actually fit more or less into London double-decker bus. Overwhelmingly men, and the only women in that category are widows and wives. So it's just striking. One reaction is how little progress there is. But my reaction is, what is going on here in the first place? Because again, including women doesn't, just simply won't change things dramatically. It doesn't seem to be changing things dramatically. But then we haven't got women dramatically into those positions of power where they need to be supported by all the ranks underneath them. So my other kind of seminar question, I haven't tried this out on a lot of people, is, okay, name me one hierarchy in the entire world of really significant power, influence, wealth, destructive capability, or capability for doing good. I mean, the UN falls into this as well, where women are dominant, where you've got your pyramid, and it's women, 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 women overwhelmingly, and then you get men at the bottom. Nobody can ever name one. And that came because the student was well, most organizations are male dominated, and that's what I thought. Hang on, it isn't. So, I mean, you might look around. I mean, I would guess maybe education and health ministries in Sweden and Finland. I don't know, I haven't looked, but even if it is true, it's not overwhelming. This is just so overwhelming that I think one needs to look at the man-to-man processes that go on. And if you are excluded from those spaces and those conversations, from the beginning, then it's kind of like not in your head. Whereas if you have been included in those spaces, like an American draft card or somewhere, and had to think about it, then you are. I mean, plus all the other kind of female excluding institutions that are still going. I mean, some of them have problems a bit, but they still are what they are. And I think they still operate in that way. And of course, many women will testify to the way that they're kind of sucked into behaving in that way necessarily, because it's organizational. So I think this is just, to kind of shine a light at a certain level and to try not to be discouraging or to be erasing what it is that women and others have had to go through. But historically, I mean, my mind is, look, what's all this, if only we could be a majority, what's this majority stuff? Men had 100%, okay, like all of them, until 1880 something. With the kind of rare female exception, it wasn't allowed to like the system, and they were really nasty and excluding about it. And I mean, I think we should apologize actually for all the horrible things, and you still see it going on. There's male hysteria at female lines persons on the football pitch, and nastiness, hostility, or dismissiveness, or not really there, things like that. I mean, it's really, and it's part of this kind of process that I'm trying to shine a light on.
Yeah, and a similar vein to Catherine's question. I feel like there's a parallel stereotype with female leaders. There's this gender essentialist that they're peacemakers, they're more cooperative. The world, we can fix the climate crisis if we had more. Look at what happens with the Iceland example you used. The last economic recession, one of the main arguments was, Iceland didn't make the same risky investment choices because they had more women at the top of the business hierarchy. So I was wondering how your book addresses, and we have sort of been talking about that, right? How a lot of times women, like I think about in the US, Hillary Clinton had to become this big war hawk as Secretary of State, and as you said, conforming to the organizational structure in order to fit into the male-dominated sphere of the military. But I'm just wondering if you've done any theorization in the book, specifically, this whole stereotype of if we just had more women in charge, all of these military conflicts would be fixed. We could have diplomatic solutions. We could have fewer nuclear weapons, and sort of the dangers of that form of essentializing. Because again, we haven't had enough to know that, and in the times, it hasn't really happened, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of where the book is coming from, and I don't mean to essentialize males and masculinities. I'm not claiming that all of the destruction and blowing people up and destroying the planet and all of that is down to testosterone or more testosterone in men than is usually the case in women, etc., etc. So, not essentialism in that way. And I guess there are two things going on. One is the domination within these organisations and setting all the rules and regulations. And when women get in, it's because men let them. They may have been pressurised and all kinds of stuff done to them, but they are the ones in charge of the organisation and the rule making, who gets in and how they behave, and all of that kind of thing. So there's all kinds of wonderful feminist work what this feels like and what it looks like. The movie called The Post, like the Washington Post and Catherine Graham, I thought that in terms of dramatic imagery, it actually did a really good job of that. And I mean, I've talked to lots of women in Simon University and things like that. It's there. So I don't have some sort of easy solution to it, but I do think that if there was more appreciation of how the domination worked amongst men, and also, my other big question, how do we get away with it? Why are people not angry? And the answer is the intra-male competition is a lot of domination, but also a lot of reward in comparison with what you get as a woman, unless you are graciously allowed to join that one way or another, and participate on a so-called equal basis. So the thing about women making a difference, I mean, it's horrible. And you need an awful lot of them working together. But so far, we don't actually have an awful lot of them who have got far enough along to work together. I mean, the anti-abortion politics is an issue in the States, so that would be really interesting to watch. And of course, they're on both sides, famously. So, but that's a long way down the whole electoral and judicial system. And I think that's the only kind of yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. As someone who has been trained as a criminologist, I appreciated your slides and your references. And it also took me back to an early essay that I read as an undergraduate student about whether women judges would actually be.
Oh, right. Okay.
You know what they have. So I guess the question I would ask is, is there any merit to sort of parsing what we mean by masculinity, who we identify, or what we're talking about when we talk about men? And so I guess that's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, many of the institutions, even on your table of contents, right, like if you think about the state or various organizations, I mean, those are profoundly colonial institutions. And so I'm wondering where, and perhaps the endurance is, about the endurance of colonialism and white supremacy. And so I'm wondering if you might respond to those two questions.
Sure. Okay, I think certainly some women have made a difference in where they got. So there's a biopic and a movie about RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I thought they were both really good. They're both based on pretty much the same material, but it particularly matters which one you watch. And it's, of course, not just on women's issues, but about jurisprudence and how you actually think legally and what you think about. And, I mean, that's how long that difference is going to last is another question, not just in terms of the results, but in terms of the legal reasoning that goes on as opposed to the original constructionists and other ways of running the Supreme Court that make some kinds of thinking and decision making possible and other kinds impossible. So you have constantly to fight back and try harder, but it's really difficult. Yes, this is colonialist, imperialist, white supremacy, or at least non-black, in terms of the G7, G8, G20, and all that kind of thing. Exactly what is going on in terms of nested male hierarchies of masculine domination, and you can go back through the historical records that we've got as long as they're textual. I watch a lot of paleoarchaeology programs, which I think are just wonderful, because people find bits of artifacts and things that construct social systems of hierarchy and values, which tells you much more about them than those people are gone. But once you've got text, and once that text gets collected and circulated, which is another issue, then we're into something that looks mostly familiar, although not completely so. And of course, a lot of work is going on, which would be very good at making a difference. But I'm not trying to argue this is eternal and it has always to be the same, because there are ways that it has changed, but not all that much. And I'm interested in processes of resistance that actually keep it there. So this can certainly be pursued through decolonizing post-colonial frames. And there's going to be all kinds of different stuff you find out about what's going on and the significance of it, and what that might mean given the kind of concepts that we start with. So there's an article by Maria Ligones, which I thought was very helpful, saying the colonial regime invented a gender order hierarchy, which displaces and erases other versions of it. But if you then look at kinship systems, if you look back to Gail Rupert's The Traffic of Movement, for instance, I'm not sure that anybody's found all that much that's hugely different. And if they did, what is that going to mean now, given the way that what I call aggressive commercialism bring all of the familiar stuff with them in terms of hierarchies of wealth and power and destructive capabilities. So I hope that's a bit of a response. Yes. Oh man,
I'm trying to think of which question I'll ask. I'll ask the easier one.
Okay.
About what is a queer state? And I was not convinced by your framing of Costa Rica as actually choosing the competitive gender hierarchy over queering. Not that I would choose the latter, but I'm thinking that there are many ways of thinking about what a queer state is, partly at the level of, so this is my harder question, at the level of sovereign decision making in the state. But what's sort of missing from your analysis, surprising to me, but maybe should be, is that you're not really looking at the disciplinary dynamics in the Foucault sense, right? And that's where the gender and the queering becomes more palpable and more prevalent, more obvious. Because if you look at how gender hierarchies are both reinforced, reproduced, but also undermined and subverted, right? That happens, and that's often more obvious at the level of disciplinary power, say in the factory floor or in the household, versus at the level of, well, we hit our gavel and make the decision that we're going to send arms here and there, and we're going to increase production of bullets for our weapons this way. Obviously in the latter case, yeah, it's the guys making the decision, but there's all these there's this disciplinary infrastructure where something else is going on, and it just seems really missing here, right? That you're not looking at that level of ground, shop floor, household, street level politics.
That's an easy one to respond to. Not everything is in the talk. So some of the ethnography is about the weapons manufacturing industry in Britain, and it's close to the shop floor because one of the major shop floors is in North Bristol. So the kinds of legitimating promos that they put out in their sort of corporate plans of kind of Anglo-Americanness actually takes up part of chapter, and that was also part of what Lauren was doing, was to bring it along to the shop floor and the representation of the shop floor and the representation of the kind of legitimacy that these manufacturers use to clean themselves up. So there's a whole kind of clean, dirty guilt going on in this. The arms traders don't do what they do in a way that's open to the public. Hey, look at all the great stuff we're doing, and here's some toys, and you can thank you for your taxpayers' money. they don't do that. They've got something to hide, and they know it. But of course, it leaks out, and that has got to be sanitized. So sanitization is one of the major analytical categories here. And that's something we got from Aaron Belkin's Bring Me Men. I think his work is really important in that respect. It's about the US military, the history, and it's got this angle, which is theoretically interesting, which is that organizations such as the military produce cleanliness and dirtiness at the same time. And there's a lot of ethnographic stuff about what really goes on militaries and has done since 1898. It starts with the Spanish-American War and they pretend to all this cleanliness and sanitization, but back around, they produce dirtiness and unsanitary qualities and all kinds of sexiness that's supposedly not clean. So at the arms trade affairs, they give away free condoms, and there's sort of sexist stuff that goes on. But it's kind of, part of the legitimation is sanitization, and part of it is a familiar kind of dirtiness, and also domesticity. There are little boxes of flowers and things around, enough women to go around to make them, and things like that. So all these processes actually going on, and the disciplinary processes come up through security, civilization, and that kind of thing. But it's there's much more exploratory stuff going on, possibly not enough food for you. But the commercial disciplines and what you have to do, and the kind of training that you've had before you get there, and that all sort of fits into the same kind of pattern.
Okay. Thank you. Very interesting talk. I was sort of I was interested by the sort of double crack setup that you used, which sort of shows that men can be the universal subject, but they're particularized only when they're the good guys. They get to be husbands, and so on and so forth. But then when they do bad things, we sort of universalize that and erase gender. This is human equal rather than a gender problem. But when you talk about hegemonic masculinity, this is a process of distinction that creates its own kind of categories of men that are not the hegemon, but they are somehow lesser. They're beta males or losers or these sorts of things. And those have their own kind of cultural support, right? I mean, especially if you look at US politics right now. I mean, these groups are very, very powerful. And they are particularized. They're particularized roles. It's not just husbands and brothers. These are types of men out there who kind of do have their own supported identities. And then conversely, because you have like Al Capone and on the screen, those are, I don't know if we look at those in terms of universal evil, right? An Al Capone person is a celebrated form of masculinity in its own way, I would say. So I'm just wondering about the relationship between the universal and the particular roles that are available, and maybe from the perspective of a legal code, some of these are endorsed and some of these are not. But culturally, it does seem that there is a great deal of support, even for the criminal types of men.
so who's in charge of culture? And who's in charge of the legal system? And who's in charge of, well, of course we're dealing with the bad guys, but then we make heroes out of them, so they're really not so bad. So you've got both things going on at once. You've got the support groups are the nested hierarchies. So essentially, you find your place in the hierarchy somewhere, and you try to get up, but you don't get too disappointed and get fired or humiliated. There's quite a lot of humiliation and fear of humiliation going on in there. So what the lens is meant to do is to get you to look for the nesting process down there, rather than just some kind of simple winners and losers. How you're supposed to come back next time and try harder, and don't feel too bad, but you're doing it to the other guy. So it may sound very generic to the whole notion of competition, but that's because who owns and operates the whole idea of competition in the first place. Hegemonic, I have banned it from my seminars because people use it as a synonym for domination or top domino. But it's, in Gramscian terms, it's domination by consent. So it poses a really interesting question. Why do people consent to their own domination? And so for Gramsci's puzzle was, why do peasants and working class people generally in his time consent to the domination of the church? What is clearly domination. Both taxes and sucking money out of it, and creating a male hierarchy that does lots of damage. So that applies to people generally. It applies within this setup, and the answer is, if you're kind of born into this sort of nested hierarchies and competition, you get along with it, and there's not much you can do as an individual to upset it unless you go the kind of way out sort of alternative gender thing, which gets incorporated. Turned into a product, absorbed within that kind of thing. So Raymond Connell talks about how adaptable the masculinizing power structures are. And I mean, once they got through screaming and spitting and being horrible, Nancy Astor took a place in Parliament, mostly. They kind of learned to live with it, but it's it's only fairly recently that they really got into this tribal attempts to have childcare and things like that. I mean, for a long time they had more gun ranges than zebra crossings, so that's it. So I mean, a lot of this is very recent, but it's not like feminism appeared. And millions of men said, "Oh my God, look, we forgot women. What about that? How could we? Please come in and take half our jobs." Okay, or here's all the power. I mean, do what you like with it. I mean, that's just not happening. And that's all I'm sort of trying to point out. Really, is that it's resistance. There's only one of my colleagues did the basic work on party selection gender quotas, which require an exemption from the UK's Equality Act, non-discrimination. So the Labour Party has an exception which has to be reviewed, that they have women-only shortlists in minimal seats. But it took a lot of time and argument to get that far in the political party. And so my colleague explained that at the present rate of inclusion into the Conservative Party, it was going to take 500 years to make a significant change in the gender balance. So, anyway, I mean, there are some things to point to that actually do make a difference, but the resistance is the story. I don't think one should underestimate that.
There are no other questions, not from the gallery.
Nothing on.
Then let's thank our speaker. Thank you, Terrell.
Great questions, really enjoyed it. Fortunately, good.